Okay, welcome back to Did Syd. This will be episode 3, and it's Did Syd more Meadows? And by that I mean, did can we trace any influences of Mr. Barrett into the album More, which was the soundtrack for the film More, or into the song Grantchester Meadows, which I believe is from Amagama. So, and I'm going to try and tie all this up together, and this is again the second time I've done this episode, and the reason for that is because there was a lot of background noise, and it was a little bit distracting. So, and believe me, this is a very long episode, so it was a little bit disappointing to realize that I needed to do it over again. But if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right. So let's go ahead then, and I gotta hurry up and jump into it because this episode is going to be really long. I think it's going to be about an hour and a half long, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Now, the first thing that I'd like to discuss, of course, is our list. So we have our list. I've been updating it on the site. I've updated it for our two new songs, Dark Globe and Birdie Hop. I'll show the list here, and that is basically our fingerprint for works that we know Mr. Barrett actually worked on. Now, some of those songs, because we're going to skip around with Mr. Barrett, they might be equal to or later than other things that we're kind of pointing to. But there is still a form of a correlation. It would be ideal if we could point to specific things before so we could kind of do cause and effect, but it's quite apparent to me now that's going to be very difficult to do. The other thing is that I kind of am keeping track of word combinations, but I'm just going to do that on the side. It's really long and it's kind of cumbersome, and I don't want to have to run through that all the time. The other correction I wanted to make is actually about the song Seesaw that we discussed from Saucerful of Secrets. Now, we mentioned that marigolds may be a reference if you are of the mindset that Mr. Barrett had a hand in the lyrics, or that perhaps he wrote it. That may be a reference to Rosemary, and it appears that in a way the song is kind of a jealous song in a way. And I just want to point out that that's a fairly normal thing among siblings. I think that sometimes a sibling or a friend or someone is doing well, and the very first thing a person thinks is that, well, I'm not doing as well as they are. So they have a tendency to get depressed, and then of course, because they actually care about the other person, they feel bad that they're jealous, so that makes it even worse, which is kind of a cycle. But you can do and feel that way and still really care about the person that you're discussing. So we know that Rosemary and Mr. Barrett had a long relationship that was a close relationship, that was apparently a very caring relationship. And so I don't think that the song Seesaw, even if Mr. Barrett had a hand in it, I don't see that as a mean-spirited song. I just want to point that out. So without further ado then, that's really what I wanted to discuss. Let's discuss the film. Now, the first thing I want to discuss, and the film might be the easiest thing to kind of discuss, is that the actual cover is for this album is put together by Hypnosis, and they did, I believe, I don't know if they did Saucerful of Secrets as well. I know they did Amagama, but I'm not sure if Hypnosis did Saucerful of Secrets. For some reason, I don't think they did. So I'm going to say that there are some interesting kind of things that are relayed in the image that is chosen to be used for the cover. It's kind of a psychedelic look to it, and it has contrasting colors that are, I guess, perhaps supposed to bring out some kind of, we've mentioned before, the psychedelic effect of flaming colors, and that's discussed, of course, in the song Flaming. But I would like to point out also that there are two kind of famous paintings of windmills that are put together by Piet Mondrian, and a French painter, a very famous modern painter. And they may be, in a way, kind of messing with that. So I'll put those up, and one of them is called Windmill and Sunlight. And Mondrian was kind of famous early in his career for using a lot of primary colors. And the other one is called Red Mill, and again, red and blue. So very, very, I don't know how to describe them. High contrasting, kind of uneasy looking, flaming feel to the colors that are used, and somewhat reminiscent, honestly, of the cover of the album More. And I think an artist that's well schooled will kind of pick up on that pretty quickly. So let's go ahead then and let's discuss the film. Now, this was kind of released in, I believe, middle to late of 1969. And I'd like to point out that that's around the time that Madcap Laughs was also being released. So we have to recognize that if there are correlations between these, that they wouldn't necessarily be able to feed off of one another. They would have to be kind of developing parallel paths. So there are a number of very interesting things, and I do recommend very much that if you're a Pink Floyd fan, you should definitely watch this film. And this film, combined with the soundtrack, combined with other things, is kind of what gave me an aha moment, like there's something really going on here. And that's what started all of this, is when I went back and I listened to More, which is an album that I've always liked from when I was a kid. I didn't really understand a lot of the background information in it, but I did really like the, well, let's just call it, it's kind of a, it is a very romantic album, but it's also a very caring and loving kind of feel to it. So it's just, in a lot of ways, it's a very kind of hopeful, it has a hopeful feel to it. So I always liked this album. And just like I said, about in the last year, I finally got the album, or the movie More, and I watched it, and I kind of was making these connections and saying, geez, that's very interesting. So here are some notes from the film. I'll suggest that you watch it. I'm not going to run through the plot of the film because you might watch it, and I don't want to throw too much of it away. I won't say it's a great film, but it's pretty good. And it was made in France. This was in the 60s when the French theater was pretty big. And you have to think of course, Bardot and other film stars that were pretty big at the time. So in the 60s, French film was pretty big. And of course, Mr. Gilmore had been touring in France, and he's fluent in French. So who knows what kind of connections he has with people there in France, but they seem to be quite extensive in my opinion. So let's run through some interesting coincidences, and I'm not going to give the film a Syd score, but I'm just going to explain some notes to you. Now, the first is that the main love interest, is a woman, Playboy Mimsy, what's her last name? Mimsy Farmer. And she has short blonde hair. So interesting. We've seen that before. We've discussed it before. Beginning with the video for Arnold Lane with the mask with the short blonde hair. There's a reference made in the film to worshiping the sun, which we've already discussed in numerous songs. Not necessarily worshiping the sun, but definitely noting the sun. The character played by Mimsy Farmer is kind of a minion to an older man, kind of a twisted man, a very materialistic man. We've kind of noted that idea in a few other songs, so just make a note of that. There is a point in time in the film when they attack a windmill, which is reminiscent, of course, of Cervantes and Don Quixote. And attacking the cross, of course, in that case would be either of two possibilities. Either an absurdity, or it's an attack on Orthodox Christianity, because the windmill looks like a cross. So and it's presented in that way in Don Quixote as well. There's also a reference to the word horse, and horse, of course, as we've already mentioned previously, I believe in No Good Trying, that it is a slang word which was common at the time for opiates, and in particular heroin, that is specifically called out in this film. There is mentioned in this film that people can break an opiate habit or opiate addiction with LSD use. And of course, interestingly, we've discussed How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. And on page 358, he begins his breakdown on how psychedelics can help break people of addiction. So somewhat known at that time already, and currently, relatively currently, let's say, being verified by modern science, that psychedelics are in fact one of the more promising uses of them is for the treatment of addiction. There is a discussion in this film about the difference between hippies and junkies or druggies. So hippies, of course, think they're going to change the world and they're going to take drugs and they're going to have this revelation and it's going to change everything. And junkies and druggies are just thinking that those other people are fools, that it's really just about enjoying this experience of drugs. So that particular aspect is specifically discussed in this film, and there also is a reference, of course, to mixing drugs and kind of passing out or going down to ground, as we've mentioned. So there are 8 things that I've just mentioned that are very interesting correlations to things that we have already discussed and seem to tie in very much, in my opinion, to the story of Mr. Barrett in many ways. So perhaps not directly for all of them, but certainly in some ways it feels like he has kind of dealt with some of these topics already. So let's go ahead then, and that's pretty much it for the film. I do suggest that you watch it, especially if you're a Pink Floyd fan. I liked it. Personally, I thought it was a pretty good film, and I'm a little bit surprised that it's so hard to get a hold of, and I'm also a little bit surprised that people apparently, I don't know, people apparently kind of think that it's not a worthwhile film, and I think they're very wrong. I think it's a pretty good film, actually. So let's go ahead then and pull apart some of these songs, and I'm going to score them with our Syd score, and I'll throw the other songs up that we've done before, and we can go ahead and discuss what some of the lyrics might mean. Okay? The first is, the very first song off the album is important. It's called Cirrus Minor. We've already noted the importance of the first song on the Madcap Laughs album, and the second song, which seems to kind of reinforce this idea that he's perhaps discussing relationships. Well, let's discuss this very first song, and I'm going to point out that every song that we're going to discuss is apparently written by Roger Waters, except for one song, Ibiza Bar, and I still don't know who wrote that song. It apparently was not accredited to anyone. I don't know if that's how it's put together on the album or what, but it's very odd to me that when I look up the discography for this and I look at who wrote Ibiza Bar, there's nobody noted for who wrote that. So let's stay on topic. Cirrus Minor. Cirrus is, of course, a kind of a cloud. That is something that Mr. Barrett has discussed before. The idea of being up in the clouds all blue, etc. So I'm going to give a point for that. And so we're at 1. But the minor kind of thing, what is up? Is it because the song is in minor keys, etc.? I don't know. But I will point out that it is possible that what is actually being discussed here is something that sounds like Cirrus, but is not Cirrus. Why someone would do that, I don't know. But the most likely thing is that this is actually Cirrus Minor. At least that's a possibility. Now, there is no Cirrus Minor. There's a Sirius, which is a star. and that's in canis major. Sirius is called the dog star. It has very specific star meanings that depend on, that have a lot to do really with what culture you're discussing. Sirius does tie in with, for the Egyptians, it ties in with the god Osiris. There's another reference to Osiris, which we've covered before. There are, I don't know how many different cultures. Of course, Sirius is a very, very bright star, so there are many cultures that are going to consider this to be a very important star. And in Chinese astronomy, we've already mentioned that Mr. Barrett was interested in Chinese things. The star is known as the celestial wolf, so there's a wolf reference. And a lot of indigenous peoples of North America associated Sirius with dogs. We've already mentioned that it's tied to Canis Major and is called the dog star. So for many Europeans, they recognize the connection to dogs. And of course, it's tied to the constellation Orion, which is a very important constellation to many, many cultures, including, of course, the Egyptians. So that's not what we're dealing with, though. We're not dealing with Canis Major, we're dealing with Canis Minor. So what is Canis Minor? Well, it's kind of an odd one. It also is tied by many cultures to the idea of dogs and wolves, and also notably foxes. So there are two stars that are visible. One is fairly bright, and the other one is barely visible. And these two stars are called Procyon and Gomeisa. I'm not sure how to pronounce these. Gomeisa and Procyon, I'm not entirely certain. But Procyon is apparently the seventh brightest star in the night sky, and is a very close star. And Gomeisa is a blue-white main sequence star, and is much dimmer. So this really does appear to be a two-star system. One star which shines bright, and the other star which is almost hidden. What an interesting concept. Isn't that interesting? So if you are someone that thinks that perhaps there's a hidden hand of Mr. Barrett in songs, I just want to point out that this album, in the very first song, Cirrus Minor, which may be referring to Canis Minor, which is a two-star system, could be referring to the idea of working with someone. Not saying that's what happened, but I will say that, I don't know, it's kind of weird. So maybe that's what's kind of going on. So let's look at these lyrics. Now, I just want to point out that my system is a little bit messed up, I think, because really what I should have been doing is a ratio kind of a system where we count up how many lines we have and how many correlations we make, and then we give a ratio, as opposed to just counting up and giving it a Syd score. But the Syd score is kind of a subjective thing anyway, so I don't really want to change it now. And the truth is, you know, if you have a really long song, it might seem like you have a lot of correlations, but it's just a really long song. And you could have a short song that's like 12 lines long and have 12 correlations, which would be 12 out of 12. That would be kind of wild. So let's go ahead then, and we'll start up looking at Cirrus Minor. I'm going to link each one of these songs with the lyrics, or you can just pull them up on your phone. So it starts off with being in a churchyard by a river. There's a reference to a river. We know that Mr. Barrett likes to discuss rivers. So I'll give a point for that. So it's 2 points. Lazing in haze, a midday. So that's a long A clang. That's 3. Laughing. Now we know that we have madcap laughs, and also laughing. I want to say laughing is used, I don't know if the river's laughing or the meadow's laughing or something. At any rate, there was a reference to a similar idea of laughing was in James Joyce, and I can't remember. It's one of the chamber music songs that I have put to music, so you can check that out if you like. I'll link it as well. So there's 4 points. Possible James Joyce reference. Laughing in the grasses in the grays. So grays rhyming with haze of the previous line. And the next line is a yellow bird. So a color and a bird. So that's 2 points. We're at 6. The bird is not alone. It sings and it flies on. What an interesting thing. That's kind of what Mr. Barrett did. He kind of sung and then he just kind of flew on. So there's another point. And laughed and then he leaved. So the F and the V sound, laughing, leaving, are very similar. So that's an LF-LV clang. I'll give another point. So we're at 8. There's willow weeping in the water, waving. So there's a W clang. I'll give a point for that. We're at 9. Mention of the river daughters. I will say that I have read somewhere that people connect that to Tolkien. I don't totally get the Tolkien reference there. But I don't need the Tolkien reference. I already have a river's daughter in Ophelia and the possibility of that being tied to Cymbeline play. So I'm going to give that another point. Ophelia from Hamlet, of course. The next bit, swaying in the ripples and the reeds. I don't really know about that one. There's a trip, and of course the trip is a possible psychedelic reference. That's another point. There's a crater in the sun. What a wonderful and strange combination of ideas. I'm going to give that a point just for being really interesting. That's wild in my mind. Almost like a mote in a person's eye, or perhaps even a black spot on the sun, which makes me think of that Police song, King of Pain. And then a mention of 1,000 miles of moonlight later, which is another group of clanging. I'll give that another point. Now, I have seen a discussion with Mr. Waters, and he discusses or breaks down that 1,000 miles of moonlight later. He mentions that it is from the poems of the late Tang and is attributed to a poet, a Chinese poet named Li Ho. And he is correct. I have that book, Penguin book, translated by A.C. Graham. And this is copyright in 1965, appears to be the first publishing of it. So Li Ho is a very interesting poet. He was considered to be kind of a madman poet, or even a bit of a spiritually kind of possessed, I guess you could say, kind of a poet. It's difficult describing these things to people because the idea of ghosts and good and evil from Eastern versus Western traditions, it doesn't necessarily translate. So ghosts and etc. Often have kind of an evil connotation in the Western tradition, but that's not necessarily true in the Eastern tradition. So Li Ho is often describing ghostly or daemonic kind of ideas. He mentions often ghostly lamps or cold blue candle flames, sinister fires, etc. And the author also relays that Li Ho reminds people quite often of Charles Baudelaire, and I would have to agree. We've already discussed Baudelaire. The first poem that I will point out is the one that's referenced for this song on page 97 of the book. The fourth line of the poem, "On the Great Wall, 1,000 miles of moonlight." Interesting, isn't it, that not only is there 1,000 miles of moonlight, which is a beautiful kind of an idea, but there also is a mention of a great wall. And of course, the Great Wall is going to be known to most people as the Great Wall of China. Now, the other thing that I would like to point out is from Don't Go Out of the Door, page 118, the last line. "Witness the man who raved at the wall as he wrote his questions to heaven." So, interesting again, there is another mention of a wall. And of course, this is much, much prior to the actual put together of the movie and the albums for The Wall. but there are two references right there to the wall, and whoever put this music together, obviously, if you believe it's Roger Waters, he knew this connection, or if something else is going on, there is a direct connection to the poems of the late Tang and a reference to a wall that may have started that whole idea of everything that was going on in the later album. Now, because this ties in with Chinese poetry, etc., we know Mr. Barrett was into reading the I Ching. I'll give that another point. So I'm going to give this a final score of 14, I believe, is what I ended up with. So that's pretty much it for that song. Let's go ahead and move on to the next song, which is called The Nile Song. Wow, very interesting, isn't that? So we went from a group of ideas that, and I'll just point out that Sirius, if you believe that Cirrus Minor is a reference to Sirius in some way, and perhaps the dog star Sirius, then for the Egyptians, this was a very important star, and it was tied to the dog days of summer, and in particular, I believe it had something to do with the Nile. So, of course, this was Orion's dog, and there are a lot of connections to it, and I'll put up some information here on the screen, I think, for the various cultures perhaps, and what they thought of Sirius. So let's go ahead then, and there seems to be a bit of a Nile connection, or a river connection, to Sirius. And what do you know, the second song is called the Nile Song. So let's go ahead then and look at the Nile Song. He says, I was by the Nile, so there's a little bit, I guess, of a clang on a long I, but I'm not going to call that. Oh, the next line is Lady Smile. So clanging on L's and long I's, I'll give that a point there, I suppose. I'll give it a point too for connecting with the previous one, which seems to be kind of showing pretty extensive planning, which is something that we know Mr. Barrett was kind of keen on. He mentions that his tears were wept like a child. Now, there are songs here that are talking about crying a lot. I don't know, maybe Mr. Waters, who supposedly wrote this, was quite vulnerable as a child. I mean, most children are, let's be honest, you know. But he's kind of a tough guy in my mind, so it's a little bit odd that he keeps referencing crying and things like that. So, I mean, that's more of a Mr. Barrett thing, so I'm going to give that a point. That's somewhat subjective, but just my opinion. There's a mention of golden hair, so there's a blonde, so that's 4. And her hair is blowing wild, almost like a wild child. We've discussed the effects of feminism in the 60s, perhaps. A mention then of spreading wings to fly. So flying, of course, is consistently mentioned in Mr. Barrett's music. Soaring high above the breezes, going where she pleases. We've already discussed that. Well, I'll give it another point for that. That's another kind of a feminist empowering kind of idea. She's going where she wants to go, and she's going to make it to the islands in the sun. So there's a sun reference. We'll give it a point for that. Watching from the window, I'm going to give a point for that because of the future references to sitting by the window. We haven't covered that yet in our Peeling Syd Barrett thing, but it'll come up. And that, I believe, is later, but it is correlative. You could say that Mr. Barrett is kind of copying this later, perhaps, but there's a mention that one day you'll catch your eye, which is kind of an odd thing to say. You would think that if you want, you don't have to follow in a shadow and just try to catch her, you just go talk to him. So it's a very passive thing. It's a very pink kind of an attitude, so I'll give it a point for that. Someone's calling from the deep and summoning a soul. So summoning a soul is kind of an esoteric idea. I'll give it a point for that. Sorry, I'm writing these down as we kind of go. There's a mention to sleep and then bringing down and dragging down. So I'll give 2 more points. So we end up with 13 on the Nile Song is what I end up with. Interesting. The next song that I would like to discuss is the Crying Song. Again, a reference to sadness. So there's a point right there. This is a very repetitive song, so I don't think we're going to get a whole lot of points on this one. So it's just kind of a fault with the system, I guess, that we're using. So smile and smile and smile and smile. And then the idea of laughter echoing in someone's eyes. Well, that's extremely poetic. It's very romantic. It's wonderful. I'll give that a point just for being kind of genius. I think that's a really beautiful thing. Mention of climbing. We've already mentioned Misty Riders climbing. That was used in, I don't know, Matilda Mother, perhaps. The next bit, a foot falls softly in the pines. That's definitely a point. And I'm going to kind of try to describe something to you here. Okay, and this one's going to be a little bit hard. So I'm at 4 points right now. So, pine, climb, pines, eyes, etc. This clanging, I'll give 1 more point, so we're at 5. Now, what I want to describe is the idea of certain consonants not being the same and not being recognized as related to most people consciously, but subconsciously they will be related. And the reason I'm saying this is because when I was young, I studied Japanese. And when you study Japanese writing, there are basically 3 systems of writing in the Japanese language. There's Hiragana, Katakana, and Kanji. And most people are familiar with the name Kanji and the confusion of it. But there are very, very simple ways of writing that are not directly word related, but are sound related or phonetic related. Hiragana and Katakana. Now, Katakana, I believe, is used mostly for foreign words. And I don't know if Hiragana does the same thing. I think it may. At any rate, they collect symbols for sounds, and then if they're related, there might be a circle next to the symbol or a series of dashes, like 2 dashes. And I'll put some of these up on the screen if I can find them. Now, the F sound, foot falls softly in the pines, F and P are related in the Japanese language for writing. And that's because it's similar in the mouth. Another one that's similar in Japanese writing is ka and ga. So as Westerners, we have totally different letters for these things. I just want to point out that these connections in Japanese writing are there. They're very easy to make, and it makes you realize that they're related. Another one is ta and ra and da. So in the Japanese language, you have a hard R, ra, and K and G are related. But anyway, let's stick with the T and the D and the R. Ta, ra, da. All very similar in the mouth. And all using kind of the same symbols, but with, like I said, the dashes and the circles to designate which one it is. Another one is ka and ga, not ja, ga. So the hard kind of a G sound, very similar in the back of the throat with a ka sound. So in these songs, and historically I have seen whoever is doing this, and I know Mr. Barrett would do this in some of his songs, he will take certain consonants and he will use them for the sounds, even though they're not what most people would recognize as clanging. And he's doing it here. Foot falls softly in the pines, the F and the P sound. Okay, we'll keep going and I'll show you some more as we go. The next bit is cry, cry, cry. Again, that's kind of a hidden sadness thing. I'm going to give that a 6. And then the sadness is passing in a while. A roll, 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 and then roll away the stone. Now, there's been mention before of a stone or a boulder. That is kind of called out in the song Terrapin, and there are other references to it as well. Request to roll away the stone. I don't know exactly what is meant by that. We have already kind of called out the idea of what a stone could be, and I don't know necessarily that I'm going to just out and out say that that's a request to be able to get away from a drug, but it could be. So, at any rate, I'm going to score the crying song a 7, and unfortunately, that's really just because there's not a whole lot of lyrics to that song. Perhaps I shouldn't have even done that song, but it's still more than Paintbox. Okay, now the next is one of my favorite songs, which is called Green is the Color. And this is an absolutely beautiful romantic song, and not just a love, but a love of life and a recognition of life. And so let's run through this one, and I think you'll realize how really wonderful this song is. Now, the first is Heavy Hung. That's the first two words right off the bat, and he's tying together the H and the H. So I'm going to give that a point because we mentioned not only the two-note slide to enter, but also the two kind of word intro that are kind of tied together. Of course, green is the color. So we have green and a mention of color, so that's 2 points. I'm going to call that out. Now, why green is the color? It's not really clearly stated, but I suspect we'll find out as we go. Correct? So green is the color. The mention is that the heavy hung, the canopy of blue. So why is canopy of blue used? It's been used by many people, of course, but I just want to point out the P and the B sound are there. We already discussed the connection. Oh, I think we said F and P, but of course P and B are also related, and you can see how an F sound is kind of soft, and the P is kind of a hard sound, but it's both on the edge of your lips, and so is the B sound. So those are related. A mention of shading eyes so that you can see someone, which is really kind of wonderful. It gives the impression that there's so much light coming from that person or from the world that it's difficult to even make that person out, which could be, of course, another drug reference, dilated eyes, etc. So we'll give that 1 point. So we're at 4. White is a light, it shines. So there's a clanging, I'll give that 1 point. And it's through the dress that she wore, which is a very romantic kind of an idea. It gives an image, it relays that image very well. And frankly, it reminds me quite a bit of the song by U2 called You're So Cruel, where he is kind of describing looking at the object of affection and through a dress, etc. And being overcome kind of with an emotion. Okay, so the next line, she's in the shadow of a wave and hazy visions of her playing. Well, there's mention of visions, so I'll give that a point. So we're at 6 now, I believe. I don't really totally see it, but sunshine and then moonshine, so we'll give 2 points for sunshine and moonshine because that's pretty consistent in Mr. Barrett's music. And those things were making her blind every time. I don't totally get that. It could just be simply saying that she has sunshine in her eyes, but moonshine, which is of course possibly a reference to alcohol, is making her blind. Blind to what? I don't know. At any rate, we're at 8. Perhaps it just means it makes her unable to see things clearly, which is a very literal reading of blind, but could still be taken as a metaphor of some kind. There's a mention that green is the color of her kind, so there's kind of an animate tied to a color, in this case green, and mention of the quickness of the eye Deceives the mind. I'm not entirely certain what all is going on there. Looking at things very quickly, hard to say. Perhaps let's keep going and then maybe we can figure that out. The next bit is about envy. So right there we have an emotion tied to a color. So that's one more point. We're at 10. We now understand that the color of her kind is tied to the idea of envy. Now that envy is described as a bond between hopeful and the damned. So what all is that really tied to? I don't know. Now the color green, of course, is not a very complex color. It's a pretty simple color. It's a color of fertility. It's a color of growth. And in its negative aspect, it is a color of jealousy and envy of material things, of course, the desire to collect things and grow. So perhaps that's what's meant by quickness of the eye and deceiving the mind. Perhaps this person is looking for better things to grab hold of, etc. I'm not entirely certain, but that's pretty much it. Quickness of the eye, deceive the mind. This is obviously about a woman. It's kind of a judgmental thing, so I'll give it one more point for that. We end up with a score of 11. And I guess that's about it. It's a little bit depressing because you can tell that whoever this person is that's writing this song, this is an extremely romantic song, but it appears that the object of this person's affection is flawed to some degree, or is recognized as flawed, and perhaps is someone that is tied to the idea of the negative side of the color green. Let's just put it like that. Now the next song I would like to discuss is Ibiza Bar, which is on the other side. Now before we move on, I just want to point out, okay, one of the reasons that I'm doing this whole thing is because I saw someone put out a video that said More is like the worst album that Pink Floyd put out, which makes me angry. You can see now all the connections that are made, and we haven't even gotten to the most complicated things yet. There is way better stuff that's about to come. So I just want to point out all these connections and all the beauty that's in this album that's easily overlooked is vastly underrated. Even to this day, I don't think most Pink Floyd fans are going to recognize this album as being a really wonderfully beautiful album. So, at any rate, let's look at the lyrics to Ibiza Bar, and there is a very specific reason why I want to look at this, and I'm not going to explain it totally in this video. There's a mention in the first line, being afraid of mistakes that were made. It's kind of clanging on the long A sound, and a recognition of mistakes that are made, which is a personal review process. I'm going to give that 2 points. Mr. Barrett seems to have been quite capable of self-review. Mentioned that someone feels hard-boiled and cut up. Man. No, these lyrics are wrong. I'm going to start over again. I do not... Here we go. So, let's look at these lyrics. And I don't know why it was like that, but whatever. So, person's afraid of the mistakes they made, and then they're shaking when they wake up, which is possibly, of course, a reference to drug addiction. Feeling like a cardboard cutout man, an empty, inanimate person, a vegetable man even, perhaps. Let's give that another point. There's a mention of, let's do the hook later, or let's call that the chorus, about building a time in the story, etc. So the person says they've aged and aged since the first page. Of course, a person's first page is kind of when they're young. So there's a reference to childhood there. Let's give that a point. Of course, a person could be viewed as a book. So when you talk about the first page of the book, that's when they're the youngest. A discussion of living every line that someone wrote. I don't totally get what that means, but there is someone that is quite concerned with connecting ideas to what other people have written and incorporating that in music. And you can say that that's Mr. Barrett or inspired by him, but I'm going to give that another point. Mention of being taken down, so or going down to the ground. There's another down, so that's another point. There's a mention of shelf above your head. So shelf, of course, tied to the idea of being a book on a shelf. I just want to point out this song is discussing a book on a shelf, so keep that in your mind because we're going to come back to that. That is a lyric that is specifically used by Led Zeppelin. Person says that they live where they're left, on a shelf like the rest, and the ending reads like a sad song. So I'm going to give that another point for the sadness of the reference, and that they were left, or perhaps left out. So there's another point. We're at 9. Please pick up your camera and use me again, whatever that might mean. Not entirely clear, but let's look at the chorus. Basically, it says, build a time and characters rhyme. In other words, where the characters kind of fit together well, and the storyline is kind. Now, I do want to point out, of course, that this is tied to a movie, and if this is in some way referencing Mr. Barrett or aspects of his life, or it's just coincidental, this does seem to be saying that you can pick up a camera and use me again if you build a time with good characters and the storyline is kind. Which is interesting, of course, because Mr. Barrett, or the ghost of Mr. Barrett, is used in, or parts of him are used in the movie The Wall, which, of course, Mr. Waters references. He specifically says that there are pieces of Roger Waters or himself in that movie, and also pieces of Mr. Barrett in that movie. So, isn't that interesting? That seems to be saying that you can use me again if the characters rhyme, etc., if things are set up well. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to give one more point for that last bit, and we end up with a 10, a score of 10. Oh, now I want to do 2 more songs, and the first is Cymbeline. Okay. Now this is going to be rough because I'm going to do Cymbeline, and then I'm going to back off of Cymbeline, and we're going to do one. We're going to actually run through the Shakespeare that's tied to that song, which could take some time. Sorry, in advance. Like I said, this is going to take a while. I'm trying to go through this as fast as I can, but honestly, it's a lot of material. Okay, so let's go ahead then. Without further ado, let's jump into Cymbeline, which is another wonderfully beautiful song. It starts off, and I'll just start with the title, Cymbeline. Of course, the Shakespearean play is Cymbeline. I believe that's how you pronounce it. It's spelled with an E instead of an A. Why is it an E instead of an A? I don't know. Perhaps it's a reference to symbols of some kind. A lot of Eastern yoga and stuff, they use symbols, I guess. It is interesting that there's an E instead of an A. And of course there's a band called the Beatles that uses an E instead of an A. I don't know what's going on. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump into the lyrics for Cymbeline. So for Cymbeline, we've got the path that you tread is narrow, and the drop sheer and very high. Okay, so this sounds like an esoteric reference to me, almost biblical. The idea that the road to enlightenment is narrow. You have to keep your eye on the straight and narrow, and that it's a sheer drop, or it's dangerous if you fail. So that's a point right there for an esoteric reference. Ravens are all watching. Of course, ravens are symbols of death in most Western kind of symbolic kind of meaning. They are, of course, also related to intelligence because they are very intelligent. Different cultures have different meanings for them, but it was very common in Christian Europe for ravens to be viewed as a negative symbol tied to death. Not necessarily true, especially in Germanic pagan Europe. The raven was quite often a positive symbol, and is so as well in a lot of Native American mythology. And it's become a more positive symbol again. But of course, in this case, it seems to be a reference to ravens watching to see if this person will fail and fall. They're watching from a vantage point, in other words, to take advantage of the situation. Apprehension is creeping. So there's a lot of P's. I guess I'll give 1 point for the apprehension creeping. Now there's a mention of tube train. I don't know if they had the tube back in then or not or whatever, but there's a mention of a tube train, so a train, and of course the train, which was used, I think, as a drawing for the Cymbeline play single. I'm not exactly sure, but Mr. Barrett made a kind of a drawing for that. Up your spine, mention of a tightrope reaching the end, and then the question, will the final couplet rhyme? I mean, it's loosely structured. It's pretty good. I don't see anything that's really, really wonderful. So let's move on then. We'll do the chorus really quick. High time, so there could possibly be a drug reference, cymbaline, high time. Please wake me, there's a reference to sleeping, so that's another point. We're at 5 points. The next verse starts with a butterfly with broken wings. So Butterfly, of course, is a song that Mr. Barrett previously did and may have made a work of art out of, as we discussed in our Peeling Syd Barrett Butterfly episode. That butterfly is falling by your side and ravens are closing in. So there we have a definitely kind of ominous symbol in the ravens closing in, and you can't hide. There seems to be disappointment with a manager and agent being interested selling photographs to magazines. So from everything I've read, the person that really was most upset with management really was Mr. Barrett above everyone else. I haven't read anywhere that anyone else was overly concerned with management. So I'll give that another point. We're at 7. And it seems to be indicating that this butterfly or this flying creature was falling or was damaged, and managers and agents didn't really seem to care. That seems to be what's relaying there. So that's a little bit disturbing to think about, that people are more concerned about selling pictures and stuff than actually talking with people and helping them through problems. But that appears to be what's being relayed there. So the next bit of the verse says there's converging lines where you stand. Converging lines are possibly an art reference, of course. You have converging lines often on a plane that you're trying to set up. They talk about moving a picture plane, so there's a picture plane specifically referenced. That's another point. We're at 9. The leaves are heavy round your feet. Now, I'm going to give a point for that, and the reason is because that idea or the feel of that line is called out in the play Cymbeline. So we'll see that in just a minute. Things strike you, moving into range. Doctor Strange. So there's a comic book reference, so we'll give a point for that. And we're at kind of 11 points on the song Cymbeline. So I'm going to say that's pretty much it. Yeah, I'm going to say that's pretty much it. So I know I'm missing some stuff, but that's okay. So I'm going to end up with a final score of 11 on Cymbeline, which really doesn't feel like it's all that high for as much words as many lines are kind of called out in that song. So there's our Syd scores on those. Um, let's go ahead then, and I'm going to take a look at some points from the Shakespearean play Cymbeline. Now, if you're not familiar with Cymbeline, basically it's about the King of the Britons in southeast England. Interesting, because we just did Saucer Full of Secrets with the references to southeastern England. Here is a king who was Cymbeline, who's apparently based on the actual king Canobeline or Sunobeline or something along those lines, and was a king of the Britons in southeastern England. Interesting. Now, in this story, he has 3 children. He's a widower. His wife has died. He has 3 children, 2 sons that were stolen, and he has 1 daughter who has eloped with someone that he did not want her to elope with. And because he has remarried, and the woman that the king has remarried, the king is named Cymbeline. She has a son named Cloten, who's kind of a clod and a jerk, and they wanted her to marry the new wife's son, and she didn't want to. She wanted to marry a kind of a lower class man that was adopted, and so she did. She eloped with him, she married him, and the king is quite angry about that, so he is forced to be exiled from England. I believe he goes to France. His name is Posthumus Leonatus. So interesting, an upper class woman, a princess, potentially a queen, and a lower class man perhaps that has to prove himself. We've discussed these themes before. I'm going to read a few lines, and I don't want to give away too much of the play. I don't suspect people will go through and actually read through it. Part of the reason why this has taken so long for me to put together is, of course, because I needed to go through and read the entirety of this play and see how many correlations I could find that were interesting to lyrics that have been used in Pink Floyd songs. Okay, so the first bit of note I will call out is, let's see, what is this? It looks like Act 1, Scene 1. I'm on line 50 or so. And this is Imogen. Imogen is the daughter, and she is extremely dedicated to her new husband. She is the daughter of the king. Imogen is a very interesting name. I've only known one, and she was from England. I've never met anyone else named Imogen. Perhaps it's a common name there. I don't know. At any rate, Imogen tells to Posthumus, her husband, but that there is this jewel in the world that I may see again. And she's referring, of course, to him. He calls her his queen. You go down to line 110. She is again, they have to part because he's being exiled. She says, "Look here, love, this diamond was my mother's. Take it heart, but keep it till you woo another wife when Imogen is dead." So she's assuming, of course, that she'll never see him again and that she'll die. Something along those lines. He exchanges with her on line 120. He says, "For my sake, wear this. It is a manacle of love. I'll place it upon this fairest prisoner." And he puts a bracelet upon her arm. So there is an exchange of gifts of kind. And I would just like to point out that there is a reference to a jewel of the world that is from her heart and was from her mother. Now, the next bit is in Act 1, Scene 4. I'm looking at line, I'm going to say it's like line 70. This is Giacomo, I believe, and he's questioning Imogen's dutifulness. He's discussing the nature of the relationship with Posthumus. He says, "If she went before others, I have seen as that diamond of yours outlusters many I beheld. I could not have seen the most precious diamond that is, nor you the lady." Posthumus says, "I praised her as I rated her, so do I my stone." So right there is a reference to a stone from a lady's heart, which is, of course, something that we discussed from Dark Globe. So that explains possibly that reference. It's interesting, of course, that Mr. Barrett has written a song like Dark Globe, which appears to be using the same kind of symbols, the stone from a heart that is specifically called out in the play Cymbeline, that is made into a song on the album More, and a song that's apparently not written by him, but is written by Roger Waters. Okay, let's keep going. Act 1, Scene 6. I'm going to say line 170. Iachimo is describing Posthumus to Imogen. He says, "He sits mongst men like a descended god. He hath a kind of honor sets him off, more than a mortal seeming." In that way, perhaps, we've already discussed quite possibly the effect of Mr. Barrett and how some people had been treating him. And I believe it was Rick Wright who mentioned the idea that there was a kind of almost like a religiousness to that group. So let's keep going. I am looking at Act 2, Scene 3. There is a song, and that song is, I don't know what line that is. Line 20. "Hark, hark, the lark at heaven's gate sings, and Phoebus gins arise." Phoebus, god of the sun. So the sun is rising. We've already mentioned the tying of the dog star and the summer, the idea of summer, and those stars. So let's keep reading here. "And Phoebus gins arise his steeds to water at those springs, on chaliced flowers that lies, and winking merry buds begin to ope their golden eyes. With everything that is pretty, my lady, sweet, arise, arise, arise." There is a reference to merry buds. Winking merry buds refer to closed marigold buds. So merry and marigold is a connection that's made right there, the same as in the song Seesaw. Let's look on then to let's call this Act 2, Scene 3, line 100. Imogen tells Cloten, she's trying to tell him that she is a fool because she's fallen in love, and he's saying that he can't leave her because she might be mad. She responds, "Fools are not mad folks." So that's an interesting line. I think the idea that someone can be very foolish and not be mad. Perhaps a bit of a thin line there, but I do want to point out that is perhaps something that relates to other things that were happening. We've discussed in our Pilling Syd Barrett, Apples and Oranges, that there may have been some form of relationship problems kind of going on. So, foolish in love, perhaps. Let's keep going. I'm going to call out Act 3, Scene 3. Page 40. "We are beastly, subtle as the fox for prey, like warlike as the wolf for what we eat. Our valor is to chase what flies." There is a reference to dogs and foxes, or foxes and wolves. Of course, we've already tied that now to the dog star and canis minor, canis major, called out here in the song, or in the play Cymbeline. The next interesting thing is the idea, of course, that there is a sensation between Posthumus and Imogen, that they are betraying one another. Her quote is kind of called out in Act 3, Scene 4, line 54. "Men's vows are women's traitors." And in a way, and Posthumus also believes that she has become a traitor because of the lies of Iachimo. So I believe it's Iachimo, but yes, Iachimo. So they go through this period of distrust and anger and jealousy with one another. Again, I'll just point out the idea of jealousy was kind of covered in the idea of green as the color. You're very in love, you're very alive, you're very jealous, you have very quick eyes, very quick temper. Could all be tied together. So let's go to the next part here. Interestingly, Act 4, Scene 2, line, I'm going to say line 78. This is, I guess, one of the gentlemen talking. He says, "The words I grant are bigger, for I wear not my dagger in my mouth." So previously we had discussed the lyric in the line Dark Globe, brandish a wand with a feathery tongue. We had discussed the idea that biblically there's the sword in the mouth kind of idea. Here is the dagger in the mouth idea, of course, which is easily understood by people that have considered the reference material. I'm going to point out Act 4, Scene 2, I believe. This is line 326. I'm not sure who's this. Is Imogen speaking. She has taken a drug and she thought it would heal things. She mentions the drug he gave me, which he said was precious and cordial to me. Have I not found it murderous to the senses? Question mark. So there's a reference there to a drug that was given as something that would help as medicine, but actually has made things worse. An interesting idea. Same act, same scene, line 344. There's discussion with a soothsayer by the Roman commander, I believe Lucius. What have you dreamed of late that of this war's purpose? The soothsayer says, last night the very gods showed me a vision. I fasted and prayed for their intelligence. Thus I saw Jove's bird, the Roman eagle, winged from the spongy south to this part of the west. There vanished in the sunbeams, which portends success to the Roman host, etc. So there's a discussion of the importance of dreams and portents. From our book, J.E. Cirlot, we can look at the meaning of eagles. Eagles are constantly referenced in this play. An eagle in the Egyptian hieroglyphic system is letter A, and it is a representative of heights and is the spirit of the sun and spiritual principle in general. The eagle is a bird living in the full light of the sun and is luminous in its essence, is tied to air and fire, is identified with the sun in male activity, which fertilizes female nature. So the eagle also symbolizes the father and potentially Osiris. And I believe we mentioned Osiris being tied to Sirius. From the Far East to Northern Europe, the eagle is a bird associated with the gods of power and war. At any rate, there are a lot of meanings tied to the eagle. It is Jupiter's bird. There's another reference to Jupiter. Of course, we've gone on long discussions about Jupiter and Saturn, of course, representing the new gods versus the old gods. Could be tied to the ideas of that era and the Great Generation versus the baby boomers. And we will see more references to Jupiter here in a minute. So, the next bit, Imogen is going to try and hide who she believes is her dead husband, but is actually not. It's Cloten. He's dressed in her husband's clothes, and he's been beheaded. So she thinks it's her husband dead, but it's not. And this is Act 4, Scene 2, line 388. I'll hide my master from the flies. There is a reference to the flies. We have discussed Birdie Hop, that strange collection of ideas of the flies. I see the flies, in this case, hiding her husband from the flies, as deep as these poor pickaxes can dig, and when with wildwood leaves and weeds I have strewed his grave, and on it set a century of prayers, I'll weep and sigh, and leaving on his service follow you, so you please entertain me. So there is a reference to flies being an agent of death, breakdown, etc. And finally, the last thing that I'd kind of like to point out is, let's see, Act 5, Scene 4. Something has happened with Posthumus. The ghosts of his family are kind of surrounding him, and they are pleading with Jupiter to help. So, line 30, no more, thou thunder master. This is Posthumus's father. No more, thou thunder master, show thy spite on mortal flies. There's another reference to flies just being simple mortal beings. So, again, I see the flies, I see mortals breaking down, mortal things tied to the material world, tied to the breakdown of material and that entire process. His family kind of discusses the idea that they are disappointed that he's suffering. His two brothers have both died. The mother and the father have both died. He's had a difficult life. The mother says, since, this is line 85, since Jupiter, our son, is good, take off his miseries. So the son has suffered, and the ghosts of the family are requesting help from Jupiter. He says, and Jupiter comes. Jupiter descends in thunder and lightning, sitting upon an eagle. There again is an eagle reference. He throws a thunderbolt. The ghosts fall on their knees. And Jupiter says, line 102, be content. Your low-laid son, our Godhead will uplift. His comforts thrive. His trials well are spent. Our jovial star, the star of Jupiter, reigned at his birth. And in our temple was he married, rise and fade. He shall be the Lord of Lady Imogen, and happier much by his affliction made. This tablet lay upon his breast, wherein our pleasure his full fortune doth confine. So, I don't know totally what's going on there, but there are references, of course, to the star of Jupiter. There are assurances that the suffering of this son will end, and it's obvious to see why with someone, if you've been paying attention to the Peeling Syd Barrett series, that this story, if this is tied all together by someone like Mr. Barrett, he would have been quite taken with this story. So, that's pretty much it for the play Cymbeline. Now, I'd like to move on to the song Grantchester Meadows. Now, of course, Grantchester Meadows is a poem that's also written by Miss Sylvia Plath and Colossus. We discussed that to some degree already. So let's look at that really quick, and there's a reason why I want to call that, and call it out, and that's because of the chorus of this song. So Grantchester, let's go ahead and Syd score this one, not from this album, but let's still run through it. The first bit, icy winds of night, be gone, not your domain. That's interesting kind of ideas, but of course icy winds. Of course, loving in the winter, so I'll give that a point. In the sky, a bird is heard to cry, so there's a crying reference and a bird reference. That's 2 more points. Misty morning, there's a misty reference. That's another point. Misty morning, whisperings, stirrings. So ings is being clang. That's another point. Very beautifully stated, I might say. Whisperings, misty mornings, stirring sounds. So silence lay, so belied, definitely silence lay all around. Very beautiful. L clanging in the last sentence, belied, deathly, silence lay all. So another point, we're at 6. Here's the bit that's very interesting. We go to the chorus. Hear the lark and hearken. We just did the song from Cymbeline that specifically calls out that combination of words. Hark, hark the lark. So that's another point. I should give that like 50 points, but whatever. So this song tied to the play Cymbeline, a piece of it. Hearken to the barking of the dog fox gone to ground. Now, of course, stars go to ground eventually, but there's a reference right there to dogs and foxes, which are tied to the very stars that we've been discussing. I'll give that another point. Splashing, kingfisher flashing to the water. So there's a lot of sh sounds that are clanging again. I'll give another point. We're at 9. Another river mention of green. That's another point. Sliding unseen beneath the trees. There's laughing, another reference to laughing, a laughing river, so I'll give that another point. Mention of the endless summer. So there is a summer reference. So the icy winds are gone. There's a summer reference here. And of course the summer is tied to Sirius and the star that we've mentioned. The 2 constellations we've mentioned. So, the dog days of summer. Lazy water meadow. All around, golden sunflakes covering the ground. What a beautiful imagery and a beautiful statement. I'm going to give that another point, and I'm going to give it another point for possibly being a reference to the tarot deck. And the reason for that is because there are kind of like sunflakes that are shown on certain tarot cards. So the imagery could be from that. In particular from the moon. The sun, interestingly, and at least in the Rider-Waite tarot deck, does not show sunflakes. It shows moonflakes, and it shows flakes on other. The tower shows, like, I guess you could say lightning flakes. They're basically supposed to be flakes of light. Perhaps particles of light as opposed to waves of light. I don't know, but I'm going to give that another point. So we're at 14 now. Basking, sunshine of bygone afternoon. Afternoon there could be symbolic, of course, for a period in a person's life. Bringing sounds of yesterday to the city room. Clanging on the bee, I'll give a point for that. Again, back to the chorus, so I'm not going to count up the chorus again, but we end up with a period of 15, or a Syd score of 15. Now, I will make one last statement before we end up here and I finish up, and that is, I just want to point out that in the story Cymbeline, there are 3 children of the king. One of them, of course, is the daughter Imogen, who is the love interest of the main character Posthumus. There are 2 sons, though, that are lost, and perhaps that's just not important necessarily to what's being relayed in the music, in the album more, or in the song itself, Cymbeline, but the actual plot and theme that's tied to those 2 sons doesn't seem to really tie in too much with the rest of this, but perhaps it will in the future. So, just going to throw that out there, and that's pretty much it. This was a lot of material, and I'm sorry it took a long time, but like I said, if you're going to do something, you might as well do it right. So, we've gone through a lot of ideas. If you would, I guess, please give a like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications if you haven't already, so that future episodes will kind of let you know what's going on. And this was not easy to put together, trust me. I spent many days thinking about how I would put this together. So that's it for tonight. Thanks for checking in, and I'll talk to you folks later.